The day my grandmother whispered 7 numbers into my ear, she didn't save my life. She destroyed the lie I had been living inside. 3 days before I walked into a courthouse carrying the only evidence that could change everything, I was still the daughter everyone dismissed. My name is Claire Bennett, and for 24 years, my family believed I existed to stand quietly in the background while my older brother, Ethan, took every spotlight. At least, that was the story they wanted everyone else to believe. If there was only one seat left at the dinner table, it belonged to Ethan. If there was one scholarship celebration, one promotion, one family toast, one proud photograph hanging above the fireplace, it always belonged to Ethan. My parents had mastered the art of making me feel invisible without ever saying the word. They never screamed. They never threw me out. They simply looked through me as though I were furniture that happened to answer when spoken to. Every birthday became another reminder that expectations only existed for one child in our house. When Ethan earned average grades, my father called him resilient. When I graduated near the top of my class, my mother smiled politely before asking if I could help organize Ethan's graduation party. Somehow, my achievements always became someone else's convenience. I stopped correcting people when they forgot my accomplishments because nobody at home seemed interested in remembering them anyway. Friends often asked why I never invited anyone over. I always blamed the old neighborhood or the small house, but the truth was much simpler. I didn't want anyone witnessing what it felt like to disappear while standing in the same room as your own family. There was only one exception. My grandmother, Evelyn Carter, never forgot to see me. Every Sunday afternoon she baked apple pie, even after arthritis made rolling the dough painful. She insisted real conversations happened in kitchens, not living rooms. While everyone else discussed investments, promotions, or Ethan's future, she quietly asked me about the novels I was reading, the photography classes I secretly loved, and the places I hoped to visit. Someday, she remembered details no one else cared enough to ask twice. She remembered my favorite coffee order, the name of my first-grade teacher, and even the little scar near my elbow from falling off a bicycle when I was 9. She made me feel like memory itself was a form of love. During her final weeks, the family visited her more often than usual, though I noticed most conversations revolved around paperwork, insurance policies, or the future of her estate. They spoke softly whenever I entered the room, then smiled too quickly as if rehearsing kindness for an audience. Grandma noticed it too. Her eyes had grown weaker, but they still carried the same calm intelligence they always had. On my last visit before everything changed, I arrived carrying a bouquet of fresh daisies from the farmer's market she loved. The afternoon sunlight poured through the nursing home window, painting golden lines across the blanket folded neatly over her knees. She reached for my hand with surprising strength and smiled the way only she could, as if she already knew tomorrow's weather while everyone else kept arguing about today. "Claire," she whispered, waiting until the hallway outside her room became quiet. "Promise me something." I leaned closer, expecting another family recipe or one more reminder not to skip breakfast. Instead, she slipped a folded piece of paper into my palm so discreetly that anyone watching would have thought she was simply squeezing my hand. I unfolded it just enough to see 7 numbers written in neat blue ink. Nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just 7 numbers. My confused expression made her smile even wider. "When I'm gone," she said softly, "don't lose that paper. One day it will tell you who never stopped loving you, and who never truly did." I slipped the folded paper into the inside pocket of my purse before leaving the nursing home, convincing myself that it was simply another one of Grandma Evelyn's mysterious habits. She had always enjoyed crossword puzzles, logic games, and little treasure hunts for her grandchildren when we were younger. 7 numbers could have meant anything. A locker combination, a birthday, a phone number. Maybe it was nothing more than a memory she wanted me to keep alive after she was gone. I wanted to believe that. It was easier than imagining there was something she had never found the courage to tell me. 2 mornings later, my phone rang just after 6:30 while I was making coffee in my tiny apartment across town. I knew before answering. Some news arrives without needing words. My mother spoke in the same controlled voice she used whenever appearances mattered more than feelings. Grandma had passed peacefully during the night. The funeral would be held on Saturday. Guests were already being notified. Before I could respond, she reminded me to wear something appropriate because many important people would be attending. Then she ended the call. No one asked how I was doing. No one wondered whether I wanted company. I stared at the untouched coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter, feeling less surprised than I wished I had been. The funeral arrived beneath a gray autumn sky, the kind that made the entire world look as though someone had turned down the brightness. Friends from church, former neighbors, and distant relatives filled the chapel with quiet conversations about Grandma's generosity, her volunteer work, and her famous apple pies. Every story sounded genuine. Every smile carried affection. I realized with painful clarity that strangers seemed to know her heart better than my own family did. My father greeted business associates near the entrance as though hosting a formal reception. My mother carefully thanked guests while occasionally mentioning how exhausting the last few weeks had been for everyone. Ethan stood near the front wearing an expensive black suit, accepting condolences with practiced confidence. Watching them, I felt strangely detached, almost like I had wandered into someone else's family gathering by mistake. After the service, everyone returned to Grandma's house, the place where every Sunday afternoon had once smelled of cinnamon, fresh coffee, and warm pie cooling beside the kitchen window. Now the rooms echoed with conversations about legal documents, property values, and future renovations. It took less than 30 minutes for the discussion to shift away from the woman we had buried and toward the things she had left behind. My mother opened cabinets searching for financial folders. My father answered questions from an attorney over the phone. Ethan casually suggested selling the house because maintaining an older property would not make financial sense. I stood quietly in the kitchen, running my fingertips across the worn wooden countertop, where Grandma had once taught me how to bake biscuits from scratch. Every scratch in the wood held a memory. Every corner reminded me of laughter that seemed impossible to hear anymore. Then my hand brushed against the folded paper still resting inside my purse. The 7 numbers. I unfolded it again beneath the soft kitchen light. They looked exactly the same as before. No names. No symbols. Just 7 carefully written digits. Suddenly, I remembered something so ordinary that I almost laughed at myself for forgetting it. Years earlier, Grandma had shown me the small antique safe hidden behind a framed watercolor painting in the upstairs study. She had joked that every family needed one place where important things could stay safe from both thieves and curious grandchildren. I had completely forgotten about it until that moment. Without saying a word, I slipped away from the conversations downstairs and climbed the familiar staircase. The hallway felt frozen in time. Family photographs still lined the walls exactly as they had for years, except one detail caught my attention. Every picture featuring Ethan occupied eye level. The only photograph of me hung near the far end of the hallway, almost hidden beside a doorway. I smiled sadly, wondering whether that had always been true or whether I had only learned how to notice it. Inside the study, the air carried the comforting scent of old books and polished oak. I closed the door quietly behind me, lifted the watercolor painting from its hook, and felt my heartbeat quicken. The small steel safe was still there, untouched, waiting in the darkness exactly where Grandma had left it. I stared at the keypad, then slowly unfolded the paper once more. For the first time since she had placed it in my hand, I began entering the numbers one by one. The keypad remained silent as I pressed the final number. For one endless second, nothing happened. Then a soft mechanical click echoed through the quiet study, so faint that anyone downstairs would never have noticed it. My breath caught in my throat. Grandma had known these numbers would still work. She had known I would come here. I slowly turned the handle and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside was no fortune, no stacks of cash, and no glittering jewelry that could explain why everyone downstairs suddenly cared so much about her estate. Instead, I found a neatly organized collection of ordinary things that somehow felt far more valuable. A leather journal rested on top of several sealed envelopes. Beneath them sat a small flash drive secured inside a clear plastic case, a thick accordion folder filled with documents, and an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. Everything had been arranged with careful precision, as though Grandma expected someone to open the safe years from now and still understand exactly where to begin. Taped to the inside of the safe door was a handwritten note. In the same graceful handwriting I had seen on birthday cards my entire life, it read, "If you are reading this, Claire, then you trusted your own heart instead of following everyone else's voices. Start with the journal. Do not let anyone know what you found until you finish reading everything." My hands trembled as I picked up the journal. The worn leather cover carried years of gentle use, its corners softened by time. Inside, the first page contained only a single sentence. "The truth is safest when it waits for the right person." I turned another page and immediately recognized the dates. The journal began nearly 25 years earlier, just weeks before I was born. Grandma described family dinners, conversations, and small observations that seemed ordinary at first. But as I continued reading, one detail appeared again and again. She frequently wrote about protecting me. Not Ethan. Me. She mentioned arguments with my parents that I had never known happened. She described moments when she questioned decisions they made about my future. Every few pages, she ended with the same heartbreaking line. "One day Claire must know why." Before I could read further, voices drifted into the upstairs hallway. Someone was climbing the staircase. I quickly closed the journal and listened. My father's voice carried through the partially closed study door. "She spent too much time up here. There has to be another file cabinet somewhere." Ethan answered with a laugh. "Maybe she hid gold bars behind the books." Their footsteps paused just outside the room before continuing toward the master bedroom. Relief washed over me, but only briefly. Whatever they were searching for, they clearly believed Grandma had hidden something valuable inside the house. They simply did not know where. I looked back into the safe and reached for the accordion folder. Inside were copies of property records, bank statements, legal correspondence, and several notarized letters. I did not have time to study every page, but one document immediately caught my attention. It was addressed to an attorney whose name I did not recognize, and across the bottom was Grandma's unmistakable signature. Clipped to the front was a yellow note that read, "Only deliver after Claire has everything." Everything. The word echoed inside my mind. This was not a random collection of keepsakes. Grandma had built an entire roadmap. Every item pointed toward another answer waiting somewhere else. Even the brass key suddenly seemed less mysterious and more intentional. I carefully returned every document to its original place except the journal, the flash drive, and the folded note. Those three items fit neatly inside my large shoulder bag without creating a noticeable bulge. Before closing the safe, I took one final look inside. Tucked beneath the bottom shelf, almost invisible unless someone bent down, was a tiny white envelope. My name appeared across the front in blue ink. No stamp, no date, just, "For Claire, after you discover the truth." I slipped it into my bag without opening it. The safe door closed with another soft click, leaving no sign that anyone had been there. I rehung the watercolor painting exactly as I had found it, checked that the frame hung perfectly straight, and quietly opened the study door. Downstairs, laughter floated through the house as relatives discussed furniture, real estate values, and possible renovations. Listening to them, I realized something had changed forever. They believed they were dividing Grandma's belongings. They had no idea she had spent years protecting the one inheritance that could never be measured in dollars. And somehow she had trusted me alone to uncover it. That evening I drove home with the journal, the flash drive, and the unopened envelope locked inside my apartment desk drawer before I even took off my coat. For the first time in years, I checked that my front door was locked twice. It was not because I believed someone would break in. It was because Grandma had never been careless, and if she had hidden these things for decades, there had to be a reason. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, placed the journal beside my laptop, and finally picked up the small white envelope with my name written across the front. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. There was no long explanation, only another short message. The flash drive explains what happened. The journal explains why. Watch first. Read second. Trust no assumptions. I inserted the flash drive into my laptop, expecting scanned documents or family photographs. Instead, a folder appeared containing dozens of carefully labeled files arranged by year. At the top sat a video titled, "If Claire is Watching." My finger hesitated above the mouse before I pressed play. Grandma appeared on the screen sitting in the same blue armchair that had always faced the living room window. Her smile was familiar, but her expression carried a seriousness I had never seen before. "Hello, sweetheart," she began softly. "If you are watching this, then I am no longer there to answer your questions, and that is exactly why I recorded this while I still could." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Everything I am leaving behind has one purpose. I do not want you to seek revenge. I want you to understand the truth before anyone else tells you a version that protects themselves." My heart began pounding. Grandma spoke calmly, choosing every word with extraordinary care. She explained that many years earlier she had started collecting copies of important family records because she noticed paperwork disappearing whenever financial decisions were discussed. At first, she believed the mistakes were innocent. Then the patterns became impossible to ignore. Documents were rewritten. Signatures changed. Conversations quietly contradicted what had been promised only weeks before. She never accused anyone publicly because she lacked complete proof, but she quietly preserved everything she could find. "People rarely destroy every copy," she said. "Most secrets survive because someone believes nobody is paying attention." The video ended after only 8 minutes, leaving me staring silently at the screen. There were no dramatic accusations, no shocking confession, only the careful observations of a woman who had spent years watching details everyone else ignored. I opened the second folder. It contained scanned letters, tax records, property agreements, and handwritten timelines connecting dates that stretched back more than 20 years. Every file included Grandma's notes in the margins, always written in blue ink. She never claimed certainty. Instead, she asked questions, circled inconsistencies, and highlighted facts that deserved another look. It felt less like reading evidence, and more like following the work of a patient historian determined to preserve the truth. Near the bottom of the folder, I discovered another document marked with bright red letters reading, "Open only after reading journal chapters 1 through 12. I almost clicked it anyway. Curiosity pulled at me with incredible force. Then I remembered Grandma's final request. She had trusted me to follow the order she created. I closed the folder without opening the file. The journal rested quietly beside my computer. As I continued reading, the entries gradually became more personal. Grandma described family holidays, business meetings, and private conversations she accidentally overheard. Some pages spoke warmly about my father before his priorities changed. Others expressed concern that my mother had become increasingly focused on appearances and social status. None of the entries sounded cruel. They sounded disappointed. Then, halfway through the 8th chapter, I found a sentence that made me stop breathing for a moment. "Claire keeps apologizing for taking up space, and nobody notices she has learned to do it." I closed the journal and stared across my apartment. I had never told Grandma that I often apologized before asking simple questions. I had never admitted that I avoided celebrating my own accomplishments because they seemed to inconvenience everyone else. Somehow she had seen it without me saying a word. As midnight approached, My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Ethan's name appeared across the screen. I answered after the second ring. His voice sounded unusually friendly. He asked whether I had noticed anything interesting inside Grandma's house after everyone left. Before I could answer, he casually added, "Dad thinks she might have hidden something important. If you happen to find anything, you would tell the family, right?" I looked toward the closed journal, then at the flash drive still glowing beside my laptop. For the first time in my life, I understood that the safest answer was not the honest one. "No," I replied calmly. "I did not find anything at all." After ending the call with Ethan, I remained perfectly still, listening to the silence inside my apartment. It was not what he had asked that unsettled me. It was how naturally he had asked it. There had been no hesitation, no curiosity about how I was coping after losing the one person who had consistently cared for me. His first concern had been whether I had discovered something valuable. I finally understood why Grandma had insisted that I trust no assumptions. Sometimes the truth did not arrive through dramatic revelations. Sometimes it appeared through ordinary conversations that suddenly sounded completely different. The following morning, I continued reading the journal exactly as she had instructed. Each chapter built upon the last with remarkable patience. Rather than making accusations, Grandma carefully documented dates, conversations, receipts, and copies of correspondence. She had created a timeline stretching across decades, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Around the 10th chapter, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Several financial decisions involving family property had been quietly revised after private meetings that excluded her. Original agreements had disappeared, replaced by updated versions carrying different terms. Grandma had somehow obtained photocopies of both versions, carefully marking every change with blue ink. There were no dramatic alterations that would immediately alarm an outsider. Instead, each revision shifted a little more control into my parents' hands while reducing protections that had originally been intended for future generations. Standing alone, each change seemed insignificant. Viewed together, they formed a deliberate pattern. My attention shifted to another folder containing correspondence between Grandma and an attorney named Daniel Harper. Unlike the legal documents, these letters were deeply personal. In one letter, written nearly 15 years earlier, Grandma admitted that she feared speaking openly because confronting the family without complete evidence would permanently divide them. She believed preserving records quietly would accomplish more than emotional arguments ever could. Mr. Harper repeatedly encouraged her to continue documenting everything and assured her that properly maintained records often became invaluable if questions ever arose in the future. Toward the end of one letter, he wrote something that lingered in my thoughts long after I finished reading. "Truth ages remarkably well. Lies require constant maintenance." I read the sentence 3 more times before setting the letter aside. It perfectly described my childhood. Every explanation I had accepted about why Ethan always came first suddenly felt fragile. Maybe I had mistaken a carefully maintained story for reality simply because I had heard it often enough. My phone buzzed again just after noon. This time, it was my mother inviting me to dinner at the family home the following evening. Her voice sounded unusually warm, almost rehearsed. She explained that everyone had been under tremendous stress and suggested it would be good for us to spend time together as a family. She even said she missed me. I could not remember the last time she had used those words. Before hanging up, she casually mentioned that the attorney handling Grandma's estate would be visiting later that week to organize remaining paperwork. The timing felt too convenient to ignore. After the call ended, I reopened the journal and continued reading until I reached chapter 12. Tucked between its pages was another folded note. "Now open the red file." I returned to my computer and clicked the document I had resisted opening the night before. Inside was a detailed inventory listing every item Grandma had placed into secure storage outside the house over the years. Copies of financial records, personal letters, audio recordings of meetings she had legally attended, photographs of signed documents before and after revisions. Each item included a storage reference number and a location. At the bottom appeared the brass key I had found inside the safe. Beside it, Grandma had written, "Safe Deposit Box. First National Bank." Daniel Harper already knows why. My pulse quickened as I realized the safe in her study had never been the final destination. It had only contained enough information to guide me towards something much larger. She had anticipated that someone might eventually discover the home safe, so she never placed every piece of evidence there. The study had been the beginning, not the end. I looked across the room toward the brass key resting beside the journal. It suddenly felt much heavier than its size suggested. Everything Grandma had done reflected extraordinary patience. She had not simply hidden documents. She had built layers of protection designed to survive long after she was gone. And now I understood why. If even a fraction of these records revealed what I suspected, then someone had spent years carefully rewriting my family's history. They believed those revisions would never be questioned because the quiet daughter they ignored would never think to look beyond the story she had been given. They had underestimated the one lesson Grandma spent a lifetime teaching me. The strongest people are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are simply the ones willing to keep reading after everyone else believes the story is already finished. The family dinner felt almost unfamiliar from the moment I walked through the front door. My mother greeted me with a hug that lingered a second too long. My father asked about my job before I even sat down, and Ethan offered to pour me a glass of iced tea without being asked. If someone had walked into the room without knowing our history, they would have seen a warm family trying to heal after a difficult loss. I saw something different. I saw people carefully measuring every word they spoke, watching every expression on my face as though they were waiting for me to reveal something I did not know I possessed. Grandma had taught me that silence often encouraged other people to fill the empty space, so I simply smiled, thanked them for dinner, and listened. Conversation drifted from neighborhood news to holiday plans before my father casually mentioned that the attorney handling Grandma's estate had scheduled a family meeting for Friday afternoon. He explained that a few remaining documents still required signatures before everything could be finalized. Ethan immediately joked that Grandma had always enjoyed making paperwork more complicated than necessary. My mother laughed politely, but I noticed she glanced toward my father before joining in. It lasted less than a second, yet it reminded me of every note Grandma had written in the journal about paying attention to the moments people believed nobody else noticed. I asked only one question. Did Grandma leave any personal letters? Three faces looked back at me. My mother answered first. Not that we know of. My father nodded almost immediately. Ethan shrugged and returned to his dinner. The conversation moved on, but I could not ignore how quickly they had answered. They sounded prepared. After dinner, I drove home instead of making the late evening trip to First National Bank. I wanted to think before acting. Grandma had spent years collecting information without rushing toward conclusions. If I wanted to honor everything she had done, I needed to learn the same patience. The next morning, I called Daniel Harper's office. His assistant answered professionally and asked for my name. The moment I introduced myself, her tone softened. "Miss Bennett," she said, "Mr. Harper has been expecting your call for quite some time." Those words sent a chill through me. We arranged to meet that afternoon. His office occupied the third floor of an older brick building downtown overlooking the courthouse square. Shelves filled with legal books lined the walls, while framed family photographs rested beside certificates earned over decades of practice. Daniel Harper himself appeared to be in his late 60s, with silver hair, thoughtful eyes, and the calm manner of someone who preferred listening before speaking. The moment I placed the brass key on his desk, he looked at it for several quiet seconds before meeting my eyes. "Your grandmother hoped this day would never become necessary," he said gently, "but she planned for it just in case." He opened a locked drawer and removed a thick sealed envelope bearing Grandma's signature across the flap. She instructed me to release this only after you found the key on your own. If anyone else arrived asking questions, I was to tell them nothing. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a detailed letter written only weeks before Grandma passed away. She explained that the safe deposit box contained original records she believed should remain untouched until I understood enough to interpret them correctly. She warned me not to confront anyone immediately, because incomplete information often led people to defend themselves before the full truth could emerge. Instead, she encouraged me to verify every document independently. Daniel watched quietly while I finished reading. Then he slid another folder across the desk. These are public records your grandmother legally obtained over the years. I have reviewed every page myself. They raise important questions, but they do not answer all of them. That part is now your responsibility. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing filing dates, property transfers, notarized amendments, and corporate records. That connected names I recognized with transactions I had never heard discussed at home. None of the documents proved criminal behavior or contained sensational discoveries. Instead, they revealed a long chain of carefully timed decisions that consistently benefited the same people while quietly reducing protections Grandma had originally insisted upon. Every document made the next one easier to understand. Every answer produced 2 new questions. When I finally stood to leave, Daniel offered one final piece of advice that sounded remarkably similar to something Grandma would have said. Do not mistake confidence for honesty, Claire. The people who are certain they control the story rarely expect someone else to read every page. As I stepped back onto the busy sidewalk, the afternoon sun reflected against the courthouse windows across the street. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt like the invisible daughter following everyone else's path. I felt like the only person willing to finish a story that someone else had spent decades trying to rewrite. Friday afternoon arrived with an almost unsettling sense of calm. The conference room inside Daniel Harper's office overlooked the courthouse square where people hurried through ordinary lives, completely unaware that a single family was about to confront years of carefully hidden truths. My parents arrived together, dressed as though they were attending an important business meeting. Ethan followed a few minutes later, greeting everyone with easy confidence before taking the chair closest to the window. I quietly chose a seat near the end of the table and placed a simple leather folder in front of me. Inside were copies of every document I had verified over the previous several days. I had followed Grandma's instructions exactly. Every record had been confirmed through public filings, bank archives, and legal correspondence. Nothing depended on assumptions anymore. Daniel entered carrying several folders and greeted everyone politely before explaining that today's meeting would finalize the remaining matters concerning Grandma's estate. My father smiled and assured him that the family appreciated all of his work. Everything sounded perfectly ordinary until Daniel opened the first folder and looked directly at me. Before we proceed, he said calmly, there is one matter Mrs. Evelyn Carter specifically instructed me to address in the presence of every immediate family member. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel removed a sealed envelope bearing Grandma's signature and placed it at the center of the table. This letter remained in my possession under legal instruction until Miss Claire Bennett independently completed the conditions outlined by Mrs. Carter. My mother's expression changed instantly. What conditions? She asked, unable to hide her surprise. Daniel simply nodded toward me. Mrs. Carter requested that Claire explain. Every pair of eyes turned in my direction. A week earlier, I would have apologized for becoming the center of attention. Instead, I slowly opened my folder and placed 3 photocopied documents on the table. Grandma wanted me to verify these before anyone discussed the estate, I said evenly. They are copies of property agreements signed over the last 20 years. Each version differs from the previous one. My father leaned forward. Legal revisions happen all the time. They do, I replied. That is why I confirmed each filing independently. I slid another document across the table. This version removed protections Grandma originally requested for future inheritance distribution. The revision was filed 6 months later. Nobody spoke. I continued before anyone could interrupt. Then another amendment transferred additional decision-making authority without updating the accompanying family memorandum. Ethan frowned as he compared the pages. I have never seen these before. Neither had I answered quietly, until Grandma left instructions showing me where to find them. Daniel handed each person a professionally prepared timeline summarizing the verified records. Every date matched official filings. Every notation referenced publicly available documents or certified copies. There were no accusations anywhere in the report, only facts arranged chronologically. My mother slowly turned the pages, her confidence fading. With each document, "Why would your grandmother keep all of this?" she whispered. Daniel answered before I could. Because she believed future misunderstandings should be resolved through evidence instead of emotion. Ethan continued studying the timeline before looking toward our father. "Dad, why are there different versions of these agreements?" My father remained silent for several long moments. Finally, he sighed deeply and removed his glasses. "Some decisions were made because circumstances changed," he said carefully. "Your grandmother never agreed with every financial recommendation." "That is true," I replied. She wrote about those disagreements in her journal. She also kept copies of the original proposals before they changed. I placed the journal gently on the table beside the documents. Nobody reached for it. They simply stared at it as though it carried the weight of 20 years. Ethan looked genuinely confused now rather than defensive. "Are you saying Grandma believed something was wrong all this time?" I shook my head. "I am saying she believed every generation deserved access to the complete story before accepting only one version of it." Daniel then opened the sealed envelope and read Grandma's final legal statement aloud. She thanked every member of the family for the years they had shared together, expressed hope that honesty would repair what silence had damaged, and explained that transparency was the greatest inheritance she could leave behind. She never accused anyone of being beyond forgiveness. Instead, she reminded us that trust could only exist where truth was allowed to remain intact. When Daniel finished reading, the room stayed completely silent. No one argued. No one raised their voice. For the first time I could remember, nobody dismissed my words or spoke over me. They simply faced the evidence that Grandma had patiently preserved, page by page, year after year. In that quiet room, I realized the greatest surprise was not that the truth had finally been revealed. It was that the daughter everyone overlooked had become the one person who refused to look away. When the meeting finally ended, nobody rushed toward the exit. My father remained seated with his hands folded across the conference table, staring at the timeline as though the pages belonged to someone else's life. My mother quietly placed Grandma's letter back inside its envelope with remarkable care, her confident composure replaced by a silence I had never witnessed before. Ethan was the first to stand, but instead of walking away, he turned toward me with an expression I could not immediately recognize. It was not anger. It was confusion. "Claire," he said carefully, "did you really believe we all knew about this?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. I stopped assuming what anyone knew a long time ago. He lowered his eyes to the documents spread across the table. I honestly thought everything had always been handled fairly. For the first time in my life, I believed him. Growing up, Ethan had received every opportunity without ever asking why they naturally flowed in his direction. He had mistaken privilege for normal life because it was the only reality he had ever experienced. He had benefited from decisions he never questioned, just as I had quietly accepted the consequences of those same decisions without realizing how deeply they had shaped my confidence. We had both inherited a story that someone else had written. We had simply been assigned different roles inside it. Outside the office building, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the courthouse steps. My parents caught up with me before I reached my car. My mother spoke first. "Claire, I know today was difficult." I almost smiled at how carefully she chose every word. "It was necessary," I replied. My father nodded slowly. "There are conversations we should have had years ago." His voice sounded older than I remembered. "Maybe," I answered. "But conversations only matter when everyone is willing to hear the same truth." Neither of them argued. Neither of them tried to explain away the documents or defend every decision that had been made. The certainty that had always surrounded them seemed to have disappeared, replaced by something far less comfortable. Reflection. During the following weeks, small changes began appearing, where I least expected them. My mother called simply to ask how work was going, then actually listened to the answer without changing the subject. My father mailed me copies of several additional family records he believed I should have possessed years earlier. There was no dramatic apology attached, only a handwritten note saying, "You deserve complete information." Ethan surprised me the most. One Saturday morning, he invited me to coffee at the neighborhood cafe where Grandma used to buy cinnamon rolls after church. He admitted that reading her journal had forced him to reconsider memories he had never questioned before. "I always thought you stayed quiet because you preferred it," he confessed. "I never realized you stopped speaking because nobody made room for your voice." I wrapped both hands around my warm coffee cup before answering. I did not realize it either. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about childhood moments that suddenly looked different from two perspectives. There was no attempt to rewrite history or pretend everything had been perfect. Instead, we slowly acknowledged what had been missing. Recognition, respect, honest curiosity about each other's experiences. Healing did not arrive all at once. It arrived in small conversations that would never have happened without Grandma's careful preparation. A month later, I returned to her house alone with Daniel Harper's permission to collect the few personal belongings she had specifically left to me. Most of them held little financial value. Her recipe box, a faded gardening hat, an old photo album filled with handwritten captions. As I packed everything into a single cardboard box, I noticed the kitchen felt strangely peaceful. The arguments about inheritance had disappeared. The whispered conversations about paperwork were over. The house no longer carried the weight of hidden questions because the truth had finally been allowed into the open. Before leaving, I paused beside the familiar kitchen window where Grandma had spent countless Sunday afternoons watching birds gather near the backyard feeder. I could almost hear her gentle laughter echoing through the quiet room. She had never wanted revenge. She had never asked me to expose anyone out of anger or humiliation. She had simply believed that a family could never become whole while parts of its story remained locked away. As I switched off the kitchen light and quietly closed the front door behind me, I realized the greatest inheritance she had protected was never hidden inside a safe, a bank vault, or a stack of legal documents. It was the courage to stop accepting the version of myself that other people had written and finally begin living the one that had always been true. 6 months passed before I finally understood that Grandma's greatest gift had never been the documents, the safe deposit box, or the careful records she spent years preserving. Those things had simply opened a door. Walking through it had always been my responsibility. Life settled into a quieter rhythm than I ever imagined possible. I moved into a brighter apartment across town, one with large windows where morning sunlight filled every room. I framed one of Grandma's favorite photographs of her garden and placed it beside my desk, where I saw it every day before beginning work. Inspired by the confidence I had slowly rebuilt, I accepted a leadership position at my company that I would have turned down only a year earlier because I would have assumed someone else deserved it more. This time I did not apologize for succeeding. I simply thanked the people who believed in me and kept moving forward. My relationship with my family remained imperfect, but it became honest. My father gradually stopped speaking to me as though I needed permission to have an opinion. Instead, he began asking for it. My mother surprised me one afternoon by bringing over a weathered cardboard box she had discovered while organizing old closets. Inside were school certificates, childhood drawings, and photographs of me that had somehow never been displayed. She admitted she had forgotten they were even there. I did not ask whether that was entirely true. Instead, we spent the afternoon looking through every memory together, and for the first time she listened as I described how invisible I had often felt growing up. She never interrupted. She never defended herself. Sometimes listening is the most sincere apology a person can offer. Ethan changed in quieter ways. He volunteered with a youth mentoring program after telling me that he wanted children to feel noticed for who they were instead of what others expected them to become. Every now and then he would call just to share something funny or invite me to dinner. We never pretended the past had been different, but we no longer allowed it to decide every conversation about the future. One crisp Saturday morning near the beginning of autumn, I returned to the cemetery carrying a small bouquet of fresh white daisies, the same flowers I had brought to Grandma during our final visit together. The trees surrounding the hillside had begun changing color, and a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the walking path. I sat quietly on the nearby bench for a long time before speaking aloud. "You were right," I whispered with a smile. "The truth did not destroy this family. It gave us our first real chance to become one." From my bag, I removed the final letter I had chosen not to read until that day. I had kept it sealed because somehow I knew there would come a moment when I no longer needed answers. I only needed her voice one last time. Inside was a single handwritten page. "My dear Claire, if you are reading this, then you have already discovered something far more important than any secret I left behind. You discovered yourself. Never measure your worth by the volume of another person's praise or the silence of their approval. People sometimes fail to see extraordinary things because they become too comfortable looking in familiar places. Do not spend your life trying to convince others that you matter. Live in such a way that you never forget it yourself. Forgive whenever wisdom allows it, but never surrender the truth to make someone else comfortable. And whenever you doubt who you are, remember this. You were never invisible to me." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. For so many years I believed I had been waiting for someone to rescue me from a life defined by rejection. In reality, Grandma had spent decades preparing me to rescue myself with patience, courage, and truth. As I walked back toward my car, the afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds and illuminated the winding path ahead. I did not look back because I no longer needed to search for proof that I had been loved. I carried that proof with me in every lesson she left behind. Some inherit houses, some inherit money. I inherited the certainty that my value had never depended on the people who failed to recognize it, and that became the one inheritance no one could ever take away.